The wind was a thief in the New Mexico territory, stealing the warmth from a person's skin and the hope from their heart. For Mae Collier, it had already taken everything else. It swept across the 400 acres of her ranch, a desolate expanse of grama grass and juniper that had once felt like a kingdom, but now felt like a cage. The dust, fine as milled flour, coated everything: the porch rails, the inside of her throat, the black mourning dress she had worn for 6 months straight. It was a constant, gritty reminder of the dryness of the land and the barrenness of her life since David was gone. They said it was rustlers, a common enough tragedy, a shot in the dark, a good man lost defending his herd. But Mae knew the truth. The truth had a name: Silas Drum, a man whose smile was as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. He wanted her land, not for the cattle it could graze, but for the lifeblood of the entire valley it held, the deep, year-round spring that fed the San Cristobal Creek. David had refused to sell. And so a land broker's greed had been laundered into a tale of common thievery, and Mae was left alone to fight a war she didn't know how to win. Every day was a battle against entropy. A fence post rotted, a calf sickened, the leather of a harness grew brittle and snapped. Each small failure was a fresh wound, a testament to her inadequacy. David had been a man in tune with the rhythms of this place, his hands broad and capable, able to coax life from the unforgiving soil. Her own hands felt small and useless by comparison. She was a woman of ledgers and letters, not of branding irons and geldings. The ranch was bleeding out, and she was trying to staunch the flow with trembling fingers. The loneliness was a physical presence, a weight that settled on her chest in the pre-dawn chill and did not lift until exhaustion claimed her at night. The silence of the house was the worst part. It was a hollow, ringing silence, filled with the ghosts of laughter and the echo of David's heavy footfalls on the wide plank floors. Sometimes she would speak his name aloud, just to hear a voice. The sound would hang in the air for a moment, thin and alien, before being swallowed by the vast, indifferent quiet. Despair was a bitter taste in her mouth, constant as the dust. She was standing on the precipice of ruin, and the only thing below was a long, hard fall. He appeared as the sun was bleeding its last color across the horizon, a stark silhouette against the bruised purple and orange of the sky. At first, she thought he was a mirage, a trick of the heat and her own weary eyes. A man on a tired-looking horse, riding not with the purposeful stride of a traveler on a known road, but with the slow, aimless drift of someone with no destination. As he drew closer, details emerged from the deepening twilight. He was lean, dressed in worn, dust-caked clothes that had long ago surrendered their original color. He sat his horse with an unnatural stillness, a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. He stopped at the gate to the yard, not presuming to enter, and waited. The gesture was one of respect, but there was something else in his posture, a deep, ingrained wariness, as if he expected the world to be a hostile place. Mae watched him from the porch, her hand hovering near the old shotgun that leaned against the doorframe. Every stranger was a potential threat, but this man was different. He wasn't swaggering or loud, he simply was. After a long moment, she stepped down from the porch, the shotgun forgotten, and walked toward the gate, her boots sinking into the soft dust. Up close, he was older than she first thought. Lines bracketed his mouth and fanned from the corners of his eyes, etched there by sun and hardship. His eyes were the most arresting thing about him. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a stillness that was unnerving, like the surface of a deep, cold well. They saw everything and revealed nothing. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and raspy, as if from disuse. It was the sound of gravel and dry leaves. "Can I help you?" Mae's own voice was tight, guarded. He gestured vaguely back the way he had come, toward the empty expanse of the world. Riding through. Saw the smoke from your chimney. Wondered if you had any work. It was the question she had been dreading and hoping for. She needed help, desperately. But hiring a drifter, a man with no name and no history she could verify, was a gamble that could cost her what little she had left. She looked at his hands, resting on the worn pommel of his saddle. They were scarred and calloused, but they were steady. There was no tremor in them, no hint of the bottle or some other lingering vice. They were the hands of a man who worked. She thought of the broken pump handle at the well, the section of fence down in the south pasture where 2 heifers had already wandered off. She thought of Silas Drum and his smiling threats. "I have work," she said, the words coming out before she could second-guess them. "But I don't have much to pay." "A roof and meals is pay enough for a while," he answered, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder at the sturdy walls of her house. "What's your name?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the only break in his composure she had seen. "Wren," he said finally. Just Wren. No surname, no story. He was a man whittled down to the essentials. Mae nodded. A decision made in the space of a heartbeat, born of a desperation so profound it felt like instinct. "There's a bunkhouse out back. It's clean enough. Supper is in an hour." He dismounted in a single fluid motion, the weariness seeming to fall away from him. "Thank you, ma'am." He didn't smile. He simply took the reins of his horse and led it toward the barn, his steps sure and even in the gathering dark. Mae stood at the gate long after he had disappeared inside, the silence of the evening settling around her once more. But this time, it felt different. It was no longer empty. It was watchful. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the rising sun, the needs of the land, and the quiet presence of the man named Wren. He was a phantom of efficiency. He rose before dawn, the soft scrape of his boots on the hard-packed earth the only announcement of his waking, and was at work before Mae had even finished her first cup of coffee. The broken pump handle was fixed by noon on his first day, the mechanism working more smoothly than it ever had under David's care. The downed section of fence in the south pasture was mended by dusk, the posts set deep and true, the wire stretched taut as a bowstring. He moved about the ranch with a quiet, purposeful energy, seeing what needed to be done and doing it without a word of instruction. He reshod the horses, his movements with the hammer and file economical and precise. He cleaned out the spring box, clearing away a season's worth of silt and debris until the water ran clear and cold again. Mae watched him from a distance, through the kitchen window or from the shade of the porch. He worked with a kind of focused intensity, a complete absorption in the task at hand, whether it was mucking out a stall or sharpening an axe blade. It was as if the simple physical labor was a form of prayer or penance, a way to keep some other, darker part of himself at bay. He rarely spoke. Their conversations were transactions of necessity. The bay mare's favoring her left foreleg, he might say, his gaze on the horse in question, or, "We'll need more salt for the herd before the first snow." He never offered opinions, never spoke of the past, never asked about hers. He ate his meals at the far end of her kitchen table, his back to the wall, his eyes downcast. The silence between them was vast, but it was no longer the terrifying void of Mae's loneliness. It had become a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of the work that bound them together. She began to notice the small things, the way he would pause in his work and scan the horizon, a slow, methodical sweep of the landscape, as if looking for something he hoped never to find. The way he never seemed to be startled. A sudden noise might make him turn his head, but his body remained utterly still, coiled and ready. One evening, she found him in the barn, gently stroking the muzzle of her mare, whispering to it in a voice so low she couldn't make out the words. There was a tenderness in the gesture that stood in stark contrast to the harshness of his appearance, a glimpse of a different man beneath the hardened exterior. She felt a fragile trust begin to take root in the barren soil of her fear. For the first time in 6 months, she slept through the night. The simple knowledge that another living, breathing soul was on the property, acting as a bulwark against the terrors of the dark. One afternoon, a week into his tenure, a storm rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised, violent shade of purple. A pregnant heifer, one of David's prize Herefords, had chosen that exact moment to go into a difficult labor. The wind howled, rattling the windows of the barn, and the rain came down in sheets. The calf was breech. Mae, her arms slick with sweat and birth fluid, fought to turn it, her heart pounding with panic. Just as her strength gave out, Wren was there beside her in the lantern-lit gloom. He didn't speak. He simply knelt in the muck, his large, scarred hands moving with a practiced gentleness, finding purchase where hers had failed. They worked together for what felt like hours, a silent, desperate team against the storm and death. Finally, with a great shuddering heave from the mother and a final expert pull from Wren, the calf slid free. It lay steaming and still on the straw for a terrifying second, before it gasped, coughed, and took its first breath. Relief washed over Mae so intensely it made her dizzy. She looked at Wren. His face was streaked with mud and blood, his pale eyes luminous in the flickering light. He met her gaze for a single, unguarded moment. In that look, something profound passed between them, a shared victory, a quiet understanding that transcended words. He had not just saved her calf. He had, in some small way, helped save a piece of her hope. The piece, fragile as it was, could not last. It was shattered on a Tuesday morning by the sound of approaching riders. Mae's stomach clenched. It was not the slow, ambling pace of a neighbor. It was the confident, purposeful trot of men who believed they owned the ground beneath their horses' hooves. She stepped onto the porch as 2 men dismounted, leaving their horses to stand ground-hitched in the yard. The one in the lead was thick-set and florid, a man named Hale who served as Silas Drum's primary cudgel. His belt strained against the swell of his belly, and his face was perpetually flushed with drink and ill temper. The other, younger and leaner, was Cody, a man whose cruelty was colder, visible in the smirk that never left his lips. They let the gate swing shut behind them with a careless bang. "Mornin', Widow Collier," Hale said, his voice a wheezing parody of neighborly charm. He took off his hat, revealing a scalp beaded with sweat. "Mr. Drum was asking after your well-being, sent us out to see how you were faring." "I'm faring just fine," Mae said, her voice colder than she felt. Her hands were balled into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. "You can tell Mr. Drum he needn't trouble himself." "Oh, it's no trouble," Cody chimed in, his eyes roaming over the house, the barn, lingering on the new fence line. "He's a charitable man, knows how hard it must be for a woman alone. Fact is, he's so concerned, he's prepared to renew his offer. A generous offer, considering the state of things." The implication hung in the air, thick and foul. The state of things he and his employer had created. "The ranch is not for sale," Mae said, each word a stone. Hale's pleasant demeanor evaporated. "Now you listen here. It's a dangerous world. Things happen. Accidents, fires. A woman alone can't be too careful. Mr. Drum is offering you a way out, a safe way out. You'd be wise to take it before your luck runs out completely." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare in the sun-drenched yard. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Mae, but it was mingled with a hot surge of fury. This was her home, David's home. They would not take it from her. Throughout the exchange, Wren had been at the far end of the yard, mending a leather trace. He had not stopped his work. He sat on a low stool, back to them, the rhythmic scrape of his awl and the pull of the thread the only sounds besides their voices and the cawing of a distant crow. He hadn't looked up, hadn't acknowledged their presence in any way. To Hale and Cody, he was just part of the scenery, a piece of hired help no more significant than the water trough. But Mae could feel his stillness. It was a listening stillness, a coiled silence that was more potent than any shouted threat. She could see the rigid line of his back, the tension in his shoulders beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. He was a stone in the middle of a stream, and the ugly currents of the conversation were flowing around him, unable to move him an inch. Cody noticed him then, nudging Hale with his elbow. "Looks like you got yourself a scarecrow, widow," Cody sneered, his gaze flicking over Wren with contempt. "He do anything besides sit there?" Wren's hand stopped moving. The rhythmic scrape of his work ceased. The sudden silence was deafening. He did not turn. He did not move a muscle. But the quality of the air in the yard shifted. The heat suddenly felt more oppressive. The sky bigger and emptier. Hale, for all his bluster, seemed to feel it too. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting from Wren's still form to Mae's defiant face. The easy confidence had leaked out of him. "You think on the offer," Hale grumbled, pulling his hat back on. "Mr. Drum ain't a patient man." They mounted their horses and rode away, kicking up a cloud of resentful dust. They did not look back. Mae stood on the porch, her body trembling with adrenaline and rage. She watched them go, then her eyes were drawn back to Wren. He had resumed his work, the scrape and pull of the thread starting up again, as if it had never been interrupted. He hadn't been a scarecrow. He had been an anchor. His silent, unmoving presence had been a statement more powerful than any weapon she could have brandished. He had done nothing, and in doing nothing, he had changed everything. The men had come to intimidate a lone woman. They had left unnerved by a silent man mending a strap of leather. The fear in Mae's heart had not vanished, but for the first time, it was joined by a sliver of something hard and sharp. Defiance. The days after Hale and Cody's visit were heavy with unspoken tension. The sky seemed to press down on the land, the air thick with the promise of a coming storm that was not meteorological. Mae found herself watching the horizon as much as Wren did, scanning the distant heat haze for the telltale dust cloud of riders. The quiet companionship she had begun to share with Wren deepened, forged in the crucible of their shared, unspoken threat. They still worked in silence for the most part, but their movements were now a synchronized dance of necessity and anticipation. He would appear with a sharpened axe just as she realized the woodpile was low. She would have a canteen of fresh, cold water ready for him before he even seemed to feel the thirst. They were two solitary lighthouses, signaling to each other across a dark and treacherous sea. One evening, as she was clearing the supper dishes, her hand brushed against his as he passed her his plate. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her that was as surprising as it was unwelcome. His skin was rough, calloused, but there was a warmth to it, a life that felt a world away from the cold finality of her grief. She pulled her hand back as if burned, a blush rising on her cheeks. He said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table, but she saw a muscle jump in his jaw. It was a moment of profound and unsettling intimacy, a reminder that they were a man and a woman, alone together in a vast and empty landscape. The memory of David's touch, once a source of comfort, now felt like a betrayal. The guilt was sharp, but beneath it was something else, something she was not ready to name, the flicker of a life she thought had been extinguished forever. She saw the new scars on his knuckles then, raw and red against the tanned skin. He had been methodically punching one of the sturdy corner posts of the corral, not in a fit of rage, but with a controlled, rhythmic violence, as if he were trying to beat something out of himself. She realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that his stillness was not peace. It was a cage he had built around a terrible energy, and the bars were beginning to strain. The man from Abilene, the one whose reputation was a ghost that had followed him across the plains, was closer to the surface than he had been in years. He was not just protecting her ranch. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one against Silas Drum, and a much older, more personal one against himself. She didn't say anything about his knuckles. Instead, that night, she left a small jar of her own herbal salve on the bunkhouse steps, along with a clean strip of linen. In the morning, the jar was gone. It was their only conversation on the matter. The end came on a night with no moon. The stars were brilliant, hard points of light in a black velvet sky, offering no comfort, only a sense of infinite distance. Mae had been unable to sleep, a knot of pure dread tightening in her stomach. She was standing by the window in her darkened bedroom, looking out over the silent yard, when she saw the first flicker of light near the far barn, the one where they stored the winter hay. It wasn't lantern light, it was a hungry, dancing orange. A torch. Then she heard them, the low laughter, the clink of a bottle, the trampling of horses where they shouldn't be. They had come back. Not 2 men this time, 4, and they had not come to talk. Terror, pure and absolute, seized her. This was it, the fire Hale had threatened, the end of everything. Her first instinct was to scream, to run, but her feet were rooted to the floorboards. She thought of David, dying for this land. She thought of the calf born in the storm, of the quiet, steady work of the past weeks. A different feeling rose up through the fear, hot and defiant. Rage. This was her home. They would not burn it. She turned to grab the shotgun, her mind racing, knowing it was a futile gesture against 4 men. But it was the only gesture she had left. And then she saw him. Wren. He moved out of the deeper shadows of the main barn, not with the cautious tread of a ranch hand, but with the fluid, silent grace of a predator. He was no longer the quiet man who mended fences. He was something else entirely. Something older and far more dangerous. He held no rifle, his hands were empty, but the way he moved, a dark shape flowing through the darkness, was more terrifying than any weapon. One of Drum's men, the one holding the torch, saw him first. "Who the hell?" he started to say, his voice slurring with whiskey. He never finished the sentence. Wren closed the distance between them in 2 silent strides. There was a blur of motion, a sound like a wet cloth striking a wall, and the man with the torch crumpled to the ground without a sound. The torch fell with him, sputtering in the dirt. The other 3 men stared, frozen for a heartbeat, in drunken disbelief. That heartbeat was all Wren needed. He was already moving toward the second man, who was fumbling for the pistol at his belt. Wren didn't wait for him to draw. His hand shot out, not in a punch, but with an open palm, striking the man under the chin with a sickening crack of bone. The man's head snapped back, and he fell like a puppet with its strings cut. The remaining 2, Cody among them, finally broke from their stupor. Fear had sobered them instantly. Cody managed to pull his gun, his hand shaking, and fired a wild shot that splintered the corner of the water trough. Before he could fire again, Wren had picked up a heavy blacksmith's hammer from a nearby stump. He didn't throw it. He moved toward them, the hammer held low at his side, his steps deliberate and utterly without fear. He was walking into the gunfire. Mae watched from the window, her hand pressed to her mouth, unable to scream, unable to look away. This was not a fight. It was an execution. The Wren she knew, the quiet, gentle man who whispered to horses, was gone. In his place was this avatar of cold, efficient violence. The third man threw his gun down and tried to run, but he stumbled, and Wren was on him, a single brutal blow with the hammer ending his flight. Cody was the last one left. He stood trembling, his pistol hanging uselessly in his hand, his sneer gone, replaced by a mask of pure terror. He looked at the bodies of his friends, then at the silent, approaching figure. "No," he whimpered. "Please." Wren stopped a few feet from him. He didn't raise the hammer. He simply stood there, a dark silhouette against the starlight, the tool of his trade and theirs hanging from his hand. He looked at the terrified man, and for the first time he spoke, his voice a low, chilling rasp that cut through the night. "Get on your horse," he said. "Ride back to Drum. Tell him what you saw. Tell him the next time he sends men to this ranch, I will not leave one to carry the message." Cody scrambled for his horse, sobbing, and galloped away into the darkness, as if the devil himself were at his heels. Wren stood for a long moment, watching him go. Then, slowly, he let the hammer drop from his hand. It landed in the dust with a soft thud. He stood over the still forms of the men he had dispatched, his chest rising and falling, the only movement in the now silent yard. Mae watched him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The immediate threat was gone, but a new, more complicated one had taken its place. The man she had hired to watch her ranch was not a ranch hand. He was a killer. And he had just saved her life. The first light of dawn crept over the mountains, painting the sky in pale, apologetic shades of gray and pink. It illuminated a scene of chilling stillness. The bodies of Drum's men lay where they had fallen, stark and terrible in the morning light. The whole sordid story of Silas Drum's ambition unraveled in the hours that followed. The lone, terrified rider, Cody, had not just fled to Drum. He had fled all the way to the sheriff in Santa Fe, babbling a half-coherent story of a demon in the dark, a story that implicated his employer in everything from attempted arson to the murder of David Collier. Drum's empire of intimidation, built on whispers and threats, collapsed under the weight of a single night of brutal, undeniable fact. The ranch was safe. The law, ponderous and late, would handle the rest. Mae felt none of the relief she should have. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the events of the night. She had spent the pre-dawn hours in a daze, watching as Wren dealt with the grim aftermath. He had moved the bodies to the buckboard with a detached, methodical efficiency that was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. There was no revulsion in his actions, no triumph, only a grim sense of task. He had done this before. He had cleaned up his own violence more times than he could count. When the sheriff's deputies finally arrived, Wren was nowhere to be seen. He had simply melted back into the shadows of the ranch, leaving Mae to answer their questions with a carefully edited version of the truth. It was a home invasion, she told them. A brave ranch hand had defended her property. She gave them his name, Wren, and nothing more. It was all she had. She found him in the barn late that afternoon. He had his saddle slung over the rail of a stall and was brushing down his horse, the same tired-looking animal he had arrived on. His meager belongings, a bedroll, a small canvas sack, were tied neatly behind the saddle. The sight of it sent a pang of loss through her so sharp it was almost a physical pain. He was leaving. The pattern, the one she had only guessed at, was reasserting itself. He was a storm that passed through, leaving wreckage and a strange, clean silence in his wake. And then he moved on. He had brought violence to her doorstep, and now he would take himself away, a self-imposed exile meant to protect her from the stain of his actions. He looked up as she approached, his pale eyes guarded, the wall between them rebuilt, thicker and higher than ever before. The gentle man who had saved her calf and the killer who had saved her life were both gone, replaced by this stranger, this stoic drifter, ready to ride. "They'll be looking for you," she said, her voice quiet in the vast, hay-scented space of the barn. "They won't find me," he replied. It wasn't a boast, it was a simple statement of fact. He was a master of disappearing. "You saved my life," she said. "You saved this ranch." He stopped brushing the horse and turned to face her fully. The light from the open barn door caught the lines on his face, making him look older, infinitely weary. "I brought this on you, ma'am. Men like Drum, they smell it on men like me. The violence. I should have kept writing." "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They were coming for me long before you arrived. You just happened to be standing in the way when they finally got here." She took a step closer. She could smell the dust and sweat on him, the faint metallic scent of dried blood he hadn't been able to wash away. She was not afraid. She looked at his hands, the hands that had fixed her pump, delivered her calf, and dealt death in the dark. They were just hands. "I saw what you did. I saw who you are." He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. He expected revulsion, fear. He expected her to tell him to go. It was what always happened. "They'll say you can't stay," Mae continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "The good people in town, the sheriff, they'll say that a man like you, a man who can do what you did, has no place here. They'll say you're a danger." She paused, letting the words hang between them. "They are not the ones who decide who has a place here." She looked him directly in the eye, holding his gaze. "I am." He stared at her, his expression unreadable, the stillness in his eyes broken for the first time by a flicker of confusion, of something she dared to hope was disbelief. He had been judged and condemned, by others and by himself, for so long that her simple acceptance was a language he no longer understood. She knew that asking him to stay was too much. It was a question freighted with a future he couldn't imagine for himself. So she asked a different question, a question about work, about the land, about the simple, shared rhythm they had found before the blood. It was a question about tomorrow, not forever. "The north pasture fence needs checking," she said, her tone practical, as if they were discussing nothing more than the day's chores. "A section near the arroyo looked weak yesterday. Will you be riding out with me in the morning?" It was an offer, not of forgiveness, for she had nothing to forgive. Not of love, for that was a country neither of them was ready to explore. It was an offer of a place, a partnership, a reason to unpack his saddle. Wren stood frozen, caught between the old pattern of flight and this new, terrifying possibility of stillness. His gaze dropped from her face to his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The hands of a killer. The hands of a ranch hand. He looked back at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, at the woman who had seen the worst of him and had not turned away. The silence in the barn stretched on, filled with the soft rustle of the horse, the buzz of a fly, the frantic beating of two damaged hearts. He didn't have his usual answer. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't have an answer at all. He slowly, deliberately, reached out and lifted the saddle from the railing, not to place it on his horse, but to set it back down on the floor.